Welcome to lecture number 80. This is historical topic 7.12, World War II mobilization. The topic is going to focus mostly on World War II on the home front, and the theme is social structures. The learning objective is explain how and why U.S. participation in World War II transformed American society. And the first key concept is broken up into two parts and shows the huge transformation brought about by the World War. It says, mass mobilization of American society helped end the Great Depression. It did so by implementing a total war strategy. That means that the government controlled the economy and set prices in order to better able manage production of war materials and food to win the war. The War Production Board and the Office of Price Administration were created to set production goals and to fix prices for consumers. They took the profit motive away from production and instead focused on having enough to win the war. The government used deficit spending to pay for all of the materials and weapons that were going towards the war. The budget deficit goes up even more compared to what it was during the New Deal that was trying to battle the Depression. The GNP, or Gross National Product, as a result, goes up 15 times. By the end of the war, the United States becomes the most prosperous nation in the world. But during the war, Americans were asked to ration in order to feed the army and Europe. Rationing extended to a variety of goods, whether they be food or consumer goods like nylon and textiles. Everyone had a set amount of each good that they could buy that they kept track of through a ration book. The textiles were used for military uniforms, and the synthetic fabrics like polyester and nylon, which had been used in women's hoses, were now used for parachutes. In order to pay for all the war costs, the income tax is raised. This was constitutional through the 16th Amendment, ratified during the Wilson administration. Initially, the income tax only affected the wealthiest Americans, but slowly it spread out across all income levels. By 1944, the income tax is deducted automatically from people's paychecks, very similar to the way it is done now. The other method of raising money for the war was through war bonds. Just like the U.S. had carried out a Liberty Bond campaign in World War I, another one is conducted for World War II. Over $100 million are raised to pay for the equipment that goes into fighting the war. The second half of that key concept says, the country's strong industrial base played a pivotal role in winning the war by equipping and provisioning allies and millions of U.S. troops. U.S. production made up for all the weakened production in Europe. Cities of our European allies were targets of bombing raids, most notably the Battle of Britain, but cities like London as the target of German air raids. The ability for factories in Europe to continue to produce war machinery was weakened because of that. Since the United States had been out of the conflict for so long and the fighting stayed out of U.S. soil aside from Pearl Harbor, the U.S. still had its infrastructure intact to output war materials. During the war, the U.S. increased that capacity. Americans produced about 100,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, and the time it took to build a new warship was down to 14 days. In the Kaiser shipyards in Northern California, workers were literally working around the clock in overlapping shifts so that there was work done on the ship at all hours of the day. It became a competition and a source of pride for the workers that they could turn out a ship in just 2 weeks' time. In order to get workers on board, there were agreements between labor and management to pause strikes during the war. Any strike would create an interruption in the war machine and risk the U.S.'s ability to win the war. In addition to this, Congress passed the Connally Anti-Strike Act in 1943 over FDR's veto. It gave the government permission to take over the operations of any industry or any company that was threatened by a strike. This wasn't unique. It had been done in the past by the first President Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had threatened to do the same in the midst of a coal strike in 1902, but that was after the strike had already started. The Connally Act was significant because it gave a preemptive warning to all that the government would not waste time to step in. The propaganda that was being put out also tried to make the workers feel like they were making a difference and a sense of purpose. The government hoped that the sense of pride they instilled would also keep any strikes at bay. The next key concept covers the new opportunities created on the home front. Mobilization provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their socioeconomic positions for the war's duration, while also leading to debates over racial segregation. About 5 million women rose up to fill the labor gap that was created by men who went off to fight the war. The percentage of married women who entered the workforce rose about 24%. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter promoted women to take up industrial war jobs. The fictional Rosie was actually very similar to those who actually entered the workforce. They actually riveted the sides of planes and ships. While initially most white women benefited from this wartime hiring, black women were also able to take similar jobs in time. Another gap which women stepped into was professional baseball. With the fear that men's professional baseball would cease during the war, a new league was created which consisted of 10 teams all across the Midwest. It had mixed success, but it had enough of a following to survive past the war years, with the last game played in 1954. Other minority groups also had new opportunities. American Indians served in the military and pioneered using Native American languages as a source of code to communicate on radio channels that could be intercepted by the enemy. Different Native American languages were used, but a lot of it was from the Navajo language. It was never deciphered by either Japanese or German spies. During the war, the U.S. tried to address the labor shortage by bringing in guest workers from Mexico. This was called the Bracero Program, and braceros worked mostly in agriculture along the West Coast, but some went as far as the Midwest. However, Mexican Americans that were in the United States during this time continued to experience discrimination. The major flashpoint in this period is the Zoot Suit riots. A zoot suit is an oversized men's suit which was popular trend amongst Mexican American men in the West Coast. It became a point of contention with the Mexican American community and service members stationed in Los Angeles. The suit took a lot of fabric to be made and was perceived as wasteful in a time of rationing. Tensions escalated and a fight broke out between suitors and service members. It turned into a rampage by American sailors across Los Angeles, targeting anyone wearing a suit, regardless of their involvement in the original fight. Service members dragged Mexican American men from movie theaters and stores and stripped them of their suits in public. To add to the humiliation, when the police involved itself, it did not arrest any service members, but instead arrested the victims of the harassment. African Americans saw World War II as an opportunity to end racial segregation. The Double V campaign stands for victory over fascism abroad and victory for equality at home. Now, African Americans served in World War II just like they had in World War I, and they continued to be put into segregated units. Advocates at home pointed to the hypocrisy of framing the war as one that's battling tyranny when the U.S. wouldn't uphold equality at home. A new civil rights group called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, formed in 1942, and they continued to be influential in the fight for civil rights into the 1960s and 70s. One of the co-founders, James Farmer, will work closely with the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration in the 1960s. Their advocacy brought on some improvements. The biggest gain for civil rights during the war was Executive Order 8802. It ended discrimination in hiring in the defense industry. It was a small step, but since most industries were closely linked with the war, it created more job opportunities for Black Americans. The order from FDR's desk said, "I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin, and I do hereby declare that it is the duty of employers and of labor organizations, in furtherance of said policy and of this order, to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin." FDR framed the fight for racial equality in terms of national security. The executive order had been prompted by A. Philip Randolph's continued proposed march on Washington. He was angry about the discrimination that African Americans endured, especially in business and industry. Finally, after enough prompting from Randolph, and a light threat that he would get African Americans to march on the nation's capital, Roosevelt issued this executive order to provide for a more equitable employment for African Americans. The second part of this key concept says, wartime experiences also generated challenges for civil liberties, such as the internment of Japanese Americans. This happens under Executive Order 9066, issued in 1942, on the fear that Japanese Americans were a dangerous fifth column, or a group of people that were working to undermine the war efforts against the Axis powers. It put close to 120,000 Japanese Americans in these internment camps across the West Coast and Southwest. Japanese Americans saw signs like the one on the screen that warned them of the upcoming internment and instructions for them to report for transport on a certain date. They're transported to internment camps, which they fashioned into small towns to try and resume a sense of normal life. The camps had schools and newspapers with an informal economy inside of the camp. Though they were prisoners in their own country, they couldn't leave the camp and were under armed watch. They were given squalid living conditions and harsh environments. Manzanar, one of the most famous camps, was at the foot of the eastern California Sierras. Temperatures in the summer were extremely hot and dry, while the winters were below freezing. Even on the way to the camps, they were treated to inhumane conditions. Japanese Americans were put in temporary housing as they awaited their transportation to the camps. Santa Anita Racetrack in Southern California was used as one of these temporary housing locations, and people literally had to sleep inside of the horse stalls before going to the camp. Internment was challenged under the court case Korematsu versus the United States. Fred Korematsu tried to evade internment, and once he was finally caught, he sued the federal government on the grounds that his habeas corpus rights were violated. The Supreme Court upheld the internment. They said that in times of war, the United States could detain people if they posed a threat to national security. In the 1980s, after investigations by the Justice Department, the U.S. government admitted that they overplayed the threat that Japanese Americans actually posed. There was no threat to national security by allowing them to continue to live their lives. Thus, those who experienced internment were given some monetary compensation in the 1980s. However, the court case was not overturned. The Korematsu decision was legal precedent for the rest of the 20th century, and it's not until 2019 that it's supposedly overturned. The 2019 Supreme Court case, Hawaii versus Trump, concerned the legality of a travel ban that kept people from certain countries, most of which had Muslim majorities, from even visiting the United States. I say supposedly because the court in 2009 upheld the actions of the Trump administration, even if it was directly targeting people by nationality on whether or not they could come to the US. The reason why it supposedly overturned Korematsu is because it's brought up in passing in the majority opinion as being wrong, though not having anything to do with the case. So in a decision that allowed the federal government to keep people out of the country under the pretense of national security, this previous decision that expanded the government's powers in cases where national security was at stake was supposedly overturned. Some legal scholars still question that it effectively overturned it, and if you're interested in more about the Japanese internment, you can read the graphic novel They Call This Enemy by actor George Takei, who lived through it as a young child. The last key concept says, migration to the United States or Mexico and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere increased, in spite of contradictory government policies towards Mexican immigration. President Roosevelt started the Good Neighbor policy in 1934. It was supposed to stress non-intervention, meaning that the U.S. government was going to stay out of Latin American issues. The U.S. would not invade them or try to bolster U.S.-friendly leaders as they had in the past. The Quota Acts that had been passed in 1921 and 1924 did not restrict immigration from the Western Hemisphere. That meant that people from Mexico, Central America, and South America could continue to go back and forth in the United States in their home country as seasonal workers. Their numbers increased to fill the labor gap that was left by the Eastern Hemisphere's migration to the U.S., especially necessary as the U.S. braced for World War II. The U.S. government also tried to alleviate the labor shortage by encouraging Mexican laborers to come to the U.S. under the Bracero program. The word bracero is the Spanish word for laborer. The program started in 1942 and guaranteed braceros a minimum wage and adequate living conditions. It brought an average of 200,000 workers every year to the U.S. The program continues beyond World War II and is formally ended in 1964 before the next overhaul of the immigration policy is implemented. Alright, here is the recap. The mobilization for World War II ended the Depression. That's one major way in which this mobilization changed American society. America's entry into the war became the lifeline for European allies. There were new job opportunities that opened up as men left to fight the war. Women, African Americans, and Mexican Americans jumped up at these opportunities. Japanese internment was implemented as a war measure, and it was racially motivated. We know this because German Americans were not targeted or were not interned. Finally, the Western Hemisphere immigration continued to increase during World War II. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit APUSHslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.